When a black woman walks into a top Manhattan law firm, the receptionist barely looks at her, dismissing her as someone who clearly doesn't belong. But what happens next leaves the entire office stunned. She's not just a visitor. She's their new boss. Watch how one moment of disrespect turns into a powerful lesson about legacy, leadership, and the true meaning of class. You won't believe how this ends. In the heart of London, where the grey skyline kissed the River Thames, stood the imposing glass tower of Ashford Crane, one of the most powerful law firms in Europe. Its reputation stretched across continents, ruthless, prestigious, untouchable. On a rainy Tuesday morning in March 2025, Danielle Moore stepped through the revolving doors, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. She was a striking figure, a black woman in her mid-30s, her tailored navy suit sharp enough to cut through the fog outside, her braids pulled into an elegant knot. She carried a leather briefcase, its edges worn but dignified, a quiet testament to years of hard-earned battles. The lobby buzzed with the usual chaos of a high-stakes firm, lawyers in crisp suits barking into phones, interns scurrying with coffee trays. At the reception desk sat a young woman, blonde and prim, her name tag reading Clara. She barely glanced up as Danielle approached. "Excuse me," Danielle said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm here for a meeting with the senior partners." Clara's eyes flicked over Danielle, lingering on her skin, her suit, her presence. A faint smirk tugged at her lips. "I'm sorry, love," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "But we don't take walk-ins. If you're delivering something, the service entrance is around back." Danielle's jaw tightened, but her expression remained steady. She'd faced this before, countless times, in fact. The assumption, the dismissal. She set her briefcase on the counter with a deliberate thud. "My name is Danielle Moore. I suggest you check your system again." Clara rolled her eyes, tapping lazily at her keyboard. More. Nope, nothing here. Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this isn't the place for—" She stopped mid-sentence as her screen flashed. Her face paled. "Wait, you're the Danielle Moore?" Before Danielle could respond, a voice boomed across the lobby. "Danielle, there you are!" It was Edward Ashford, the firm's silver-haired patriarch, striding toward her with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind him trailed a gaggle of partners, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. "Welcome to Ashford Crane. We've been expecting you." Clara stammered an apology, but Danielle waved it off. She wasn't here for petty victories. She was here to claim what was hers. Upstairs, in a boardroom lined with oak panels and portraits of dead white men, the truth unraveled. Danielle wasn't just a visitor. She was the firm's newest managing partner, appointed in a secretive vote after the sudden death of her predecessor, Sir Reginald Crane. The announcement had been kept under wraps, partly because of the firm's internal politics, partly because of who Danielle was, a black woman from Brooklyn, raised by a single mother who cleaned offices to pay the bills, now holding the reins of a legal empire built on centuries of privilege. It was a scandal waiting to erupt. Edward poured her a glass of scotch, his hands trembling slightly. "Reginald spoke highly of you," he said. "Said you were the future. I'll admit, some of us weren't convinced, but your record speaks for itself." Danielle took the glass but didn't drink. "I'm not here to convince anyone, Edward. I'm here to do the job." The room shifted uncomfortably. She could feel their eyes, some hostile, some intrigued, boring into her. They didn't know the half of it. Reginald Crane hadn't just been her mentor. He'd been her father. Danielle's mother, Grace, had worked as a cleaner in Reginald's Manhattan office decades ago. A brief, forbidden affair had followed, one Reginald buried under layers of wealth and denial. Grace never told him about the pregnancy, raising Danielle alone in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. It wasn't until Danielle, fresh out of law school, landed an internship at Crane's New York branch that their paths crossed. She didn't know who he was at first, just an old British lawyer with a sharp mind and a sharper tongue. But Reginald saw something in her. Grit, brilliance, a mirror of himself. Over the years, he pieced it together. He never acknowledged her publicly as his daughter, but he'd groomed her in secret, preparing her for this moment. Now, with Reginald gone, Danielle had inherited more than a title. Tucked in her briefcase was a letter he'd left her, sealed with wax and written in his spidery hand. It revealed a bombshell. Ashford Crane had built its fortune not just on law, but on a history of exploitation, cases defending corporations that profited from slavery, land grabs, and worse. Reginald had wanted to dismantle it, to atone. He'd chosen Danielle to finish what he couldn't. Her first week was a battlefield. Partners like Simon Hargrove, a red-faced barrister with a colonial mindset, openly challenged her. "You're an outsider," he sneered during a meeting. "This firm's legacy isn't yours to rewrite." Clients hesitated, some pulling accounts when they learned who was in charge. The press caught wind, headlines screaming, "American upstart shakes up London's legal elite." Racism wasn't loud here. It was subtle, coded in polite smiles and closed doors. But Danielle felt it every day. Then came the case that changed everything. A whistleblower from a major client, a shipping conglomerate, slipped her a file. It detailed modern-day trafficking, hidden under the guise of labor contracts, with Ashford Crane's fingerprints all over the legal cover-up. Danielle saw red. This wasn't just about legacy anymore. It was about justice. She called an emergency meeting, slamming the file onto the boardroom table. "We're dropping this client," she declared, "and we're exposing them." The room erupted. Edward begged her to reconsider. Simon accused her of sabotage. But Danielle stood firm. "This firm's done enough damage. It stops now." The boardroom at Ashford Crane was a war zone. Papers scattered across the table. Voices clashed like thunder. Danielle stood at the head, unflinching as Simon Hargrove jabbed a finger in her direction. "You're delusional if you think we'll tank a multi-million-pound client over some bleeding heart crusade," he roared. "This isn't Brooklyn, Ms. Moore. This is London." Danielle met his glare with steel. "And this isn't 1850, Simon. We're not shielding criminals anymore." She slid the whistleblower's file toward him. Photos of cramped ship holds, forged documents, names of workers who'd vanished. "You signed off on this. Explain it." Simon's face turned purple, but he said nothing. Edward intervened, his voice a strained plea. "Danielle, think of the fallout. Jobs lost, reputations ruined, ours included. There's a way to handle this quietly." "Quietly?" She laughed, sharp and bitter. "That's how we got here. No more." She turned to the room. "We expose them, or I walk, and take this file to every newspaper in the city." The threat hung heavy. After hours of shouting, a vote was called. It was razor-thin, but Danielle won. The firm would drop the client and cooperate with authorities. Simon stormed out, muttering about betrayal. Edward slumped in his chair, defeated. But a few, like Priya Patel, a junior partner with a quiet fire in her eyes, nodded in approval. Danielle had her first ally. That night, Alone in her office, she opened Reginald's letter again. "The firm's sins are deep, Danielle," he'd written. "But you're the blade to cut them out. Don't falter." She traced the words, feeling the weight of his faith and his cowardice. He'd known the truth but never acted. Now it was on her. Sleep didn't come. At 3 a.m., her phone buzzed. An anonymous text. "Check the basement, file 47B. Her pulse quickened. The firm's basement was a labyrinth of old records, off-limits to most. She grabbed her coat. The basement smelled of mold and secrets. Flickering fluorescent lights cast shadows over dusty shelves. Danielle found file 47B buried behind a stack of ledgers. A thick dossier, its edges yellowed. Inside were contracts, memos, photos, evidence that Ashford and Crane had spent decades sanitizing the crimes of Europe's elite. There were ties to colonial plunder, modern tax havens. Even the shipping case she'd just uncovered. Names jumped out. Politicians, CEOs, and chillingly, Reginald Crane. Her stomach churned. He hadn't just known. He'd orchestrated it. The letter, his mentorship, it wasn't redemption. It was a confession, a plea to clean up his mess. She sank to the floor, the file spilling around her. Then she heard footsteps. "Danielle?" It was Priya, holding a flashlight. "I saw your office light on. Figured you'd be here after that text." "You sent it?" Danielle asked, wary. Priya shook her head. "No, but I've suspected something like this for years. I just didn't have proof. Or the guts." She knelt beside her. "What now?" Danielle clutched the file. "We burn it down. Metaphorically. We take this public, all of it." Priya hesitated. "They'll come for you. Simon, the clients, maybe worse." "Let them," Danielle said. "I've got nothing to lose." The next morning, Danielle leaked the files to the BBC. By noon, London was ablaze with the story. Law firms' dark past exposed. Protesters gathered outside Ashford and Crane, chanting for justice. Inside, chaos reigned. Simon resigned, hurling insults as he left. Edward tried to salvage the firm's image, but the damage was done. Clients fled. The stock plummeted. Danielle faced the press on the steps of the building, rain soaking her suit. "This firm profited from pain," she said, voice steady. "It ends today. We'll rebuild, or we won't. But the lies stop now." The fallout was brutal. Lawsuits piled up. Threats arrived. Letters, calls, a brick through her flat's window. But allies emerged too. Priya stood by her, digging deeper into the firm's past. Whistleblowers came forward. Slowly, painfully, Ashford and Crane began to shift. Danielle pushed for pro bono work, hiring lawyers from marginalized communities, turning the firm into a weapon for the powerless. It wasn't perfect. Racism lingered in whispers, in sidelong glances. But it was a start. 6 months later, Danielle sat in a cafe overlooking the Thames, the city's lights shimmering on the water. The firm teetered on the edge of collapse or rebirth, too soon to tell. She'd won battles, lost others. Simon was rumored to be plotting a rival firm, vowing revenge. Edward had retired, broken. Priya was now her right hand, a partnership forged in fire. Her phone buzzed. Another anonymous text. "You've only scratched the surface. Paris, next." A chill ran through her. The firm's tentacles stretched far. London was just one city. She thought of Reginald's letter. his sins, her mother's resilience. This wasn't over. Danielle sipped her coffee, eyes on the horizon. Justice wasn't a finish line. It was a road, winding and rough. She'd walk it, no matter where it led. The world watched, waiting to see if she'd falter. She wouldn't. The story didn't end neatly. It couldn't. Racism didn't vanish with one victory. It lurked in shadows, in systems, in hearts. But Danielle Moore had lit a spark, one that could fade or flare into something unstoppable. What came next? Paris? A fight bigger than she'd imagined. The answer hung in the air, a question for tomorrow.